She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't armed. She wasn't asking for attention. Chief Angela Rhodes was just a black woman in a lounge chair, enjoying her Saturday like any other neighbor. But one man didn't see her that way. What happened next would shake the entire neighborhood in ways no one expected. Angela Rhodes had learned a long time ago that peace was something you had to make time for. After 3 relentless weeks filled with back-to-back night shifts, budget meetings with the mayor's office, and training a batch of fresh-faced rookies, all she wanted was a day without a phone ringing. No squad cars, no paperwork, no crime scene tape. Just silence, sun, and the steady rhythm of splashing water. It was just past noon on a Saturday when Angela stepped out of her modest one-story home in the gated community of Willow Ridge. She slipped into a pair of worn-in sandals, sunglasses perched atop her head, and a chilled water bottle tucked under her arm. The warm breeze of early summer curled through the oak trees, lining the cul-de-sac as she made her way down the short sidewalk that led to the community pool. Angela wasn't wearing her badge that day. She wasn't Chief Rhodes. She was just Angela, a 52-year-old woman in a long-sleeve t-shirt and black capri joggers, her tightly coiled hair pulled up into a no-fuss bun. She looked like any other off-duty neighbor, and after living in Willow Ridge for over 9 years, she felt every bit of that title, neighbor. She bought her home here outright, served twice on the HOA security committee, had attended more community potlucks and board meetings than she could count. She knew the families with newborns and the retirees who still pruned their hedges like it was a neighborhood competition. She waved to her mailman by name. She even brought cookies to the lifeguard's mother when she was recovering from surgery. In other words, this place was hers, in every real and meaningful way. So when she stepped through the black iron gate of the pool, nodded at the young lifeguard, a college kid named Louise, who always called her Miss Rhodes with a shy smile, and settled into the lounge chair near the shallow end, Angela felt something rare, grounded, belonging, no rank, no pressure, just being. The pool was only half full. A couple of older couples flipping through paperback novels in the shade, a few kids with water wings squealing near the steps, a young mom in a flowing sundress trying to coax her curly-haired toddler into a pair of floaties. Everything was peaceful, warm, and beautifully mundane. Angela exhaled and leaned back in her chair, letting the heat soak into her shoulders. She closed her eyes, not quite asleep. Just there, present, unbothered, for a moment. Then came the footsteps. They were confident, crisp, not the lazy shuffle of someone heading to dip their feet in the water, but the precise click of a man with purpose. Her instincts kicked in before she opened her eyes. Years of law enforcement had wired her to feel tension before it made a sound. When she did look up, there he was, a tall white man in khaki shorts and a stiffly tucked-in polo. Late 40s, maybe 50, clean-shaven, not a drop of sweat on his brow despite the heat, and in his eyes, not a trace of warmth, no towel, no sunscreen, no child trailing behind him. Just a clipboard peeking from under his arm, and that particular kind of energy Angela recognized from 100 prior encounters. Entitlement, looking for a problem. "Excuse me," he said with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Do you live here?" Angela blinked, sat up just slightly. She didn't reach for her water bottle. Not yet. "I do." "Really?" he replied, folding his arms. "Because I've lived here a whole month, and I've never seen you here before." Angela looked him over, mentally noting the unopened HOA welcome packet sticking out of his back pocket. Fresh blood, she thought. New to the neighborhood, but already acting like he ran the place. "I live 3 houses down," she said evenly. "Been here since 2014. The man let out a short, mirthless chuckle. "Right, and you just, wandered in?" "No," Angela said, still calm. I came in through the gate, just like everyone else. He tilted his head, skeptical. You got your key fob on you? It's in my bag. He didn't ask to see it. Not yet. Instead, he stepped a bit closer, casting a long shadow across her chair. I've just never seen you before, and we've had some issues lately. People sneaking in. You can understand why I'd be concerned. Angela watched him, quiet now, her sunglasses still resting on her head, her fingers curled loosely in her lap. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about pool access. It was about her skin, her face, the fact that she didn't look like what he expected a neighbor to look like. His voice was steady, polite even, but the accusation was loud. She'd seen this before. At parks, on sidewalks, even in the precinct. Not every form of racism came with shouting. Some wore golf shirts and tried to sound helpful. Angela Rhodes didn't flinch because she knew exactly where she stood, and the man standing in front of her, he was about to learn it too. Angela didn't budge. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, posture composed, voice even. She'd seen this routine before, just not pointed at her in her own neighborhood. Dennis, still looming, shifted his weight with manufactured authority. You know, he said, gesturing vaguely toward her bag, this could be real simple. If you have your key fob, just show it and we can move on. She looked at him, one brow raised behind her sunglasses. I don't owe you anything, Dennis. That struck him. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even moved, but the edge in her voice was unmistakable. It wasn't anger, it was certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from living through decades of being questioned, followed, underestimated. Dennis forced a chuckle. Come on now, it's not personal. I'm just trying to make sure everything's above board. Angela's eyes stayed steady. Number, you assumed something the second you saw me, and now instead of backing off, you're digging deeper to justify your mistake. He opened his mouth, then paused. Around them, the pool had begun to change. Not dramatically, this wasn't a scene, but subtly. A few people were looking over their sunglasses. A nearby teen stopped scrolling on her phone and began watching. The mother with the toddler moved a few feet closer to her child. It wasn't loud, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air had weight now. Dennis noticed too. His voice dipped slightly, tone more defensive. I just think it's strange I've never seen you here. In a whole month. Angela tilted her head. Maybe you're not as observant as you think. The sarcasm was light, but it landed hard. He crossed his arms, clearly uncomfortable. Listen, if you really live here, I don't get why you're making this a thing. We have rules for a reason. My wife and daughter come here, and I care about their safety. And I care about mine, Angela replied evenly. But your issue isn't safety, it's control. You saw a black woman sitting by herself and decided that couldn't be right. That's not fair, Dennis snapped, louder now. This has nothing to do with race. Then what does it have to do with? She asked, not letting him off the hook. He hesitated, and that hesitation was louder than any denial. Angela leaned back in her chair, but her eyes never left him. She could feel the attention growing, still subtle, still unspoken, but undeniable. Dennis shifted his stance again, as if unsure whether to double down or retreat. A familiar voice cut through the tension. You all right over there, Angela? It was Carl, retired Navy, lived 2 doors down. He didn't raise his voice, didn't stand up, just called out from his chair with casual concern, the kind of concern that carried weight. Angela nodded once. All good, Carl. Thanks. Dennis blinked. He looked from Angela to Carl, then back again. It was clear something had shifted inside him. The assumption he'd been operating on, that she was alone, that no one would vouch for her, had crumbled. Still, his pride wouldn't let him walk away. You could have just shown the fob, he muttered. I mean, if you really live here, it wouldn't be that hard. Angela finally moved, not to stand, not to argue, but to reach slowly into her bag. Dennis watched, expecting proof. Instead, she pulled out her water bottle, took a sip, and set it down. Then she said, "You know, I've trained rookies on how to de-escalate situations like this. First thing I teach them, stop assuming you know everything." Dennis didn't respond. Across the pool, the lifeguard, Luis, had now pulled out one of his earbuds. He was sitting up straighter, watching. Angela continued, "You came over here looking for a problem. Now you're stuck in it because you thought your assumptions were fact." Dennis bristled. "I'm just trying to keep the community safe." "And who keeps me safe?" she asked. "When someone walks up on me, questions me, challenges my presence in a space I've paid into for 9 years?" There was no answer. The teen near the pool had begun recording. Angela saw it. Dennis did too. She didn't stop her. "You think you're subtle," she said, "but you're not. You didn't come over here with concern. You came with judgment. You made a decision about who I was the second you saw me. That's not security. That's profiling." Dennis stepped back slightly. His arms dropped from his chest. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it." "Yes, you did," Angela replied, still calm. "Maybe not out loud, but it was there." He looked around again and saw what she already knew. The pool had gone quiet, and now he was the one on display. Angela didn't move. She didn't have to. The silence did the work for her now. The weight in the air was no longer hers to carry. It had shifted to Dennis, and he felt it. He looked down at the concrete for a second too long, then straightened up again, like he was about to reclaim control. "I didn't come over here to start something," he muttered, but it was too late. The something had already begun. What Dennis had done wasn't loud. He hadn't cursed. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't physically threatened anyone. But Angela knew, so did everyone else watching, that subtle racism didn't need to scream to cause harm. It lived in the tone, the assumptions, the loaded questions dressed up as concern. It lived in the idea that someone like her needed to justify their presence, while someone like him could move unquestioned. Subtle racism didn't knock. It assumed it already owned the house. Angela sat still, her sunglasses hiding nothing. "You know what's interesting?" she said, voice even. "If I were a white woman sitting here in the same chair, you'd have waved and kept walking." Dennis scoffed. "That's not true." "It is," she replied simply. "You didn't see a neighbor. You saw a threat." From the corner of the pool, the teen with the phone slowly lowered it, not recording now, just watching. Not out of fear, but something else. Recognition. Like she'd seen this kind of thing happen before and never knew what to do about it. Now she was seeing someone who did. Angela reached into her tote bag again, this time slowly, deliberately, and pulled out her badge case. She didn't say a word as she opened it. The gold shield caught the sunlight like it was made for moments like this. City of Brookridge Chief of Police, Angela M. Rhodes Dennis, stared. His mouth opened slightly. He took half a step back before catching himself. Angela didn't move. "You said you were concerned about safety," she said quietly. "Well, congratulations. You just tried to check the person responsible for it." A ripple moved through the pool deck. Quiet conversation stopped. Heads turned now openly, not out of gossip, but shock. Mrs. Florence, seated a few chairs down in a wide-brimmed sun hat, stood slowly. "Chief Rhodes," she said gently, "you want me to call Ken from the HOA board?" Angela shook her head. "Appreciate it, Florence. No need." But Dennis was unraveling now. He turned, searching for backup that wasn't coming. Carl folded his newspaper with a loud snap and muttered just loud enough, "Some folks never learn to look before they leap." Dennis looked back at Angela, clearly trying to recover. I didn't know. I mean, you weren't wearing the uniform. That's the problem, Angela said. You think respect is earned through a title or a badge. But I didn't need either to be sitting in this chair. Luis, now fully upright on the lifeguard stand, called down, "Everything okay, Chief?" Angela nodded. "We're good, Luis. Just a little misunderstanding." Dennis winced at the word, but Angela wasn't done. "You came over here because something didn't look right to you. That something was me, not what I was doing, not what I was wearing. Just me existing in a space you thought I didn't belong." Dennis tried again. "I was just following the rules." "No," she cut in. "You were following a story in your head, one where someone like me is always the outsider, the intruder, the exception to the rules you think you're upholding." The young mom nearby was nodding now. She pulled her toddler a little closer, but her eyes never left Angela. More people were paying attention. The quiet had turned into understanding. Angela stood up, not in anger, but because it was time. "Let me explain something to you," she said to Dennis. "Racism doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't have to come with slurs or violence. Sometimes it walks right up in khaki shorts and a smile, asking polite questions with ugly undertones." Dennis said nothing. "And when that happens," she continued, "someone has to say it out loud. Because if we keep letting it slide just because it's soft-spoken, it never stops." Florence added softly, "Amen to that." Angela closed the badge case and slipped it back into her bag. Then she picked up her water bottle, took a slow sip, and turned back to her lounge chair. "I was having a peaceful day before you walked over," she said without looking at him. "I plan to get back to it now." Dennis hesitated for a moment longer. Then, with no more words, no more bravado, he turned and walked toward the gate. And just like that, the man who thought he could police the pool was gone. But the lesson? It was just getting started. Angela didn't watch Dennis leave. She didn't need to. His retreat said everything. She sat back down in her chair, adjusted her sunglasses, and let her body ease into the stillness again. The water in the pool rippled softly. Laughter returned in cautious waves, and a breeze nudged the umbrella beside her. The moment was over, but its echo lingered. That's what calm power looks like. Angela hadn't shouted. She hadn't made threats. She hadn't needed to raise her voice or flash her badge the way people imagine police do in movies. Her authority hadn't come from volume. It came from presence. And that was what left the deepest impression. Across the pool, Florence sat back down, her wide-brimmed hat angled just enough to block the sun. She didn't say a word, but her small nod toward Angela spoke volumes. It was the kind of silent affirmation that only those who've been through it understand. Carl, the Navy veteran, picked his paper back up, but this time he didn't read. He just watched the water, processing. Angela reached for her water bottle again, took another sip, and folded her hands in her lap. That's when Luis, the lifeguard, walked over. Barefoot, towel slung over one shoulder, face flushed, not from heat, but something closer to regret. "Chief Rhodes," he said quietly, stopping just beside her chair. Angela looked up, giving him her full attention. "I'm sorry I didn't step in earlier," he said. "I saw it, but I wasn't sure what to do. I thought maybe you had it under control." "You thought right," Angela replied with a small smile. "But I appreciate you checking in." Louis nodded, clearly still wrestling with his own hesitation. It didn't seem that serious at first. And then it was." Angela leaned forward slightly. "That's how it usually works. It doesn't always come with yelling or threats. It's the little things, the looks, the tone, the questions that aren't really questions." He nodded again. "It won't happen again. Not if I'm on shift." She gave him a gentle pat on the forearm. That's all I needed to hear. Luis walked back to his post, a little taller than before. Angela knew what had just happened wasn't about Dennis. Not really. He was a symptom. The deeper issue was the way people like her were still treated as out of place in the very communities they helped build. And too often those moments passed unnoticed, brushed off as misunderstandings, shrugged away. But today hadn't been quiet, because she hadn't let it be. Later that afternoon, when Angela left the pool, her towel slung over one shoulder and her sandals brushing the pavement, she passed a few neighbors gathered near the parking lot. Conversations hushed slightly. Someone whispered her name. A woman in yoga pants gave her a hesitant smile. Angela didn't return it with smugness, just a nod. They'd seen something, and even if they didn't fully understand it yet, they felt it. That evening, as she prepped dinner, grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, a sparkling water with lime, her phone buzzed. A message from Eliza, her longtime friend who lived just a few blocks away. Heard about the pool. Did you really show him the badge? Angela smirked as she typed back, didn't show it, just reminded him who he was talking to. Because that was the truth. The badge didn't speak for her. She spoke through it when she chose to, and when the moment truly called for it. It hadn't been about proving a point. It had been about drawing a line, quietly, firmly, without showboating, because dignity doesn't have to make noise. It just has to stand. Angela placed her badge back on the kitchen counter that night, same spot it always rested when she was off duty. It hadn't done anything new that day. It hadn't arrested anyone, issued a citation, or enforced policy. But it had reminded a neighborhood, and perhaps a few hearts, that the person who looks out of place might just be the one keeping everyone else safe. And that's a kind of power no volume can match. The next morning, Angela walked her usual route through the neighborhood just after sunrise. The air was crisp, the sky painted in soft streaks of pink and gold. It was the same community she'd patrolled in and protected for over a decade. But today, something felt different, not louder, just more aware. As she passed the community clubhouse, a fresh sheet of paper caught her eye on the bulletin board. In bold black letters, "Know Your Neighbors." Beneath it was a photo from last year's community safety event. Angela, in uniform, shaking hands with the mayor, her nameplate clearly visible. And underneath, in neat handwriting, "To the man who questioned her yesterday, maybe try reading the newsletter next time." Angela didn't laugh, but she smiled, slow and real. Someone had seen. Someone had cared enough to speak up. Maybe not in the moment, but now when it still mattered. She kept walking, the rhythm of her sneakers steady against the sidewalk. A woman watering her rose bushes gave Angela a nod. A man jogging past gave a quick, "Morning, Chief." These weren't big gestures, but they weren't nothing either. They were acknowledgments. Later that morning, she stopped by the local cafe, the Corner Roast, where she always grabbed a cup of black coffee and an everything bagel on Saturdays. Jonah, the barista with the untamed curls and music always playing through his earbuds, looked up the moment she walked in. "You're trending," he said, grinning. "Nextdoor app blew up overnight." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Somebody posted about the pool incident," he continued, already pouring her coffee. "Said you handled a neighborhood confrontation with more grace than anyone they'd ever seen." She sighed, only half amused. "It wasn't a confrontation. It was a correction." Jonah nodded. "Exactly. That's why it stuck with people." As she walked out of the cafe, coffee in hand, Angela's phone buzzed again. A message from her assistant at the station. "You might want to see this." Attached was a screenshot of a post from the neighborhood forum. No name attached, just a story. "I watched something at the pool yesterday that changed how I see people. A woman was accused of not belonging. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She just reminded all of us what dignity looks like. I didn't know who she was until she showed the badge. Turns out she's our police chief. Maybe we should ask ourselves why that mattered only after the fact." Angela paused in the parking lot, letting the words settle. That post wasn't for her. It was for them. The neighbors, the quiet ones, the watchers on the edge. And now some of them were speaking. That afternoon, Mateo, the 9-year-old boy from next door, showed up at her porch with the garden hose his mom had borrowed earlier in the week. He was breathless, cheeks flushed from the sun. "Miss Angela," he said, "my mom said you made the pool man scared." Angela chuckled softly. "No, baby, he wasn't scared. Just surprised." He nodded, thoughtful. "She said you were like a superhero." Angela bent down to meet his eyes. "Superheroes wear capes. I wear sneakers and deal with paperwork." He grinned. "Still cool." Later that evening, Angela's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Luis. "Hey, Chief. I've been thinking about what happened. I froze, and I'm sorry. I should have stepped in sooner, but I saw how you handled it, and I learned a lot." She replied simply, "That's all I ask, Luis. Learn, and don't be quiet next time." And it seemed he wouldn't be the only one. On Sunday, a new discussion thread had popped up in the HOA's community site. This time not about rules or violations, but about education. One neighbor had suggested holding a workshop on implicit bias. Another recommended a community meet and greet for new residents to foster familiarity and trust. For the first time in a while, the comments weren't just noise. They were direction. Angela didn't need the praise. She didn't need the recognition. But what she did need, what mattered most, was that silence had shifted. People who once watched with lowered eyes were now looking up, speaking up, checking in. That wasn't just support. It was change, starting to breathe. And Angela knew, in a world where so much damage is done quietly, real progress often starts the same way, with soft voices growing louder, and with one person reminding the rest that belonging shouldn't require proof. By Monday morning, the rhythm of the neighborhood returned. Sprinklers ticking on before dawn, garage doors humming open, dogs barking at joggers making their morning rounds. On the surface, everything looked the same, but Chief Angela Rhodes knew better. Something had shifted, not just in the people who now waved a little longer or paused to say thank you, but in the space itself, in the awareness. The quiet had changed tones. It no longer carried the weight of avoidance. Now it held something closer to reflection. Angela sat at her dining table, sipping her black coffee. Her badge lay on the counter, polished and untouched since Saturday. It hadn't needed to be wielded. It had only needed to exist. The real power, after all, wasn't in the metal. It was in the restraint, in the way she had used her voice, and when she had chosen not to. Later that morning, she received a small, cream-colored envelope in her department mailbox. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "Chief Rhodes, I watched what happened. My daughter did too. She asked me why you didn't get mad. I told her you didn't have to. You already knew who you were. Thank you for showing her that dignity doesn't need anyone's permission." Angela folded the note gently, setting it next to her badge. That was the message. That was always the message. Dignity isn't loud. It doesn't argue for space it already occupies. It doesn't bend to make others feel comfortable. And it certainly doesn't ask to exist. It claims its place, with quiet assurance, with unshaken calm, and with the kind of presence that teaches everyone watching how to carry themselves a little taller. Angela didn't need to prove she belonged. She never did. The people who had watched that day, the teen at the pool, the toddler's mother, Luis on the lifeguard stand, even Dennis, had witnessed something that couldn't be undone. They'd seen how subtle racism tries to wrap itself in rules and etiquette, and they'd seen it peeled back, exposed, not with violence or shame, but with clarity and control. That's what left the mark. Not the confrontation, but the grace in how it was handled. And maybe next time, when someone like Angela's questioned, when someone's presence is doubted for no reason but their skin, their gender, their age, they'll remember. Not just what she said, but what she didn't say. The power in standing still, the courage in refusing to shrink, the authority in simply existing without apology. As Angela stepped outside that morning, the sun rising behind the terracotta roofs, she passed by the community board again. The Know Your Neighbor's post was still there. A few new notes had been scribbled in the margins. One read, "Seen and respected." Another simply said, "Thank you." Angela didn't stop to read them all. She didn't need to. She walked on, badge in her bag, dignity in her step, reminding the world one quiet moment at a time that she never needed anyone's permission to be exactly who she was. And neither do you.